Hi, good morning. This is Rebecca Jacobs, and this is my Learning Coach support session on inquiry and research skills for grades 3 through 5. This is a really fantastic age to start teaching the inquiry process, the research process, and the skills that accompany those processes. I like to use this visual to introduce the idea of the research process because I think it's a little bit broader than that. I like to start with this idea of tuning in, paying attention to the interests of the students. The more we can empower them to come up with their own ideas on what they want to research or find out, the more engaged they will be in the process. The second step would be finding out. This is the beginning of that inquiry process of looking for information about the topic. Sorting out is really the note taking and the use of lots of different resources to try to find information. Going further is when they might um, deepen their understanding, add their own ideas, contribute some original thought. Then they would make conclusions, and this would be, um, adding their ideas to the information they find from others, as well as putting it together into a format to be shared. And then the last one is taking action. So, how are they going to solve that problem? How are they going to better understand or explain that problem? And then, how are they going to share the work that they've done? So, I think inquiry is one of the most important parts of the research process. For this age, the best thing to do is just focus on questions, questions, questions. These students in this age range have questions all the time. So, think about what are they trying to understand or figure out about the world that matters to them. So, one idea is if a student was interested in animals that live in the ocean, I would encourage them to take that further. How do animals live in the ocean? What kinds of food sources are important? Would humans be able to live in the ocean? So you want to kind of encourage them to extend their line of questioning to come up with a really specific, interesting idea of something that they can research. We're trying to move away from summarizing into more original thought and critical thinking, kind of move up the layers so that they're really doing the more challenging work of analysis. Okay, so I always get this question are things changing so that they should only be using the internet at this point? Is Google enough for a research project? And I honestly think they should be doing both. I think they should be using text sources as well as the internet. I always recommend at least 2 books and 2 articles or web pages at this age is reasonable. If you don't have access to libraries right now, Epic Books has some great selections, or you can find digital books that they can use. Um, when doing beginning research, it's best to research a topic that has a number of available resources. If it's too obscure or specific, they may have trouble finding appropriate sources. You really want there to be a range of sources at their reading level. So be a bit cognizant when they're kind of choosing their research topics um, to help them find something that will work to find information that they will be able to understand. Always start with a question. What are they trying to understand or figure out through this process? Some tips for using the internet effectively. In the beginning, I think it's best to give them 5 or 6 websites to start from. If they want to just Google, if they're my son, for example, would want to do the Googling on his own. If they do insist on that, make sure they can identify government websites, museums, universities, newspapers, and magazines. What are appropriate kinds of websites to use for research as opposed to just browsing the internet? So it should be a slightly different process. I don't recommend at this age using something like Google Scholar yet because they're not going to be able to read those articles. It's just too much. But do keep in mind and maybe help them find a couple websites to start with can always be really useful. Make sure they know the basics of .edu equals education, schools, colleges, etc. .org is usually indicates an organization. This can be helpful to figure out if it's a museum or a nonprofit. .gov is government. This can be useful for national parks or if they're researching, um, country-specific information, geography. And then, of course, .com means commercial or businesses. Now, that doesn't mean they won't find some useful information on .com sometimes, but just that it can be a better starting point to start with .gov, .org, or .edu. For example, This is the Natural History Museum, and as you can see, it's a .org. So if we click through, you can see I've identified this article, Paleontology at the National History Museum. So assuming they may have an interest in this. But what I want you to see is that if you go to this website, almost everything on here is kid appropriate. So they can kind of do their browsing themselves. And the articles are also written at a level made for students. So it's an easier place to begin research. That's why I kind of recommend most museums have a section kind of geared for students or aquariums. So if you can find something related, to their topic, that's a .org, that's a museum, that can be a really good starting point to find, age appropriate, accurate information. All right. So try to avoid, obviously, websites that are trying to sell them anything, websites that ask for personal information. Remind students to never give away their personal information on the internet. Websites that might be misleading or fake or inaccurate or out of date, make sure they check the date and check the links to see if the website's kept up to date, especially important for topics in the sciences, as that information can change. The next step in the process after they've started kind of finding relevant resources is note-taking. So I truly believe research is an active process and should be done with purpose. You don't want them just skimming the internet forever. You want them to find answers to specific questions and write those down. So you want them to have kind of a system of organizing their ideas. I think note-taking can be done in many different ways. I think it's best if the notes are broken up into short 1 to 2 sentence chunks at this age. So no more than that in each section. You can section it in lots of different ways. So my example here was using Post-its. And so for each subtopic, there's a set, I don't know if you can see at the bottom, there's like a set of Post-its with facts. This is my own son's volleyball notes. But you can also use a template, something like this. For this, I would have them put in their sources first by copying and pasting, the website or typing in the title, then print it and go ahead and have them write their facts. Make sure you identify whether they're paraphrasing or using quotation marks as they begin to take notes. The goal for notes would be that they would have more information collected than they will use in their final project or paper. So it should be a lot of information, and then they can narrow down what they actually will end up using. Notes should not be copied exactly from the text unless they use quotation marks. So they can use a quote as one section of their notes, but ideally they're using their own words in the notes to avoid kind of any issues with plagiarism. So I have to talk about it because it's such a kind of prevalent part of learning how to research and learning how to write. Plagiarism can be a huge problem among students beginning in these younger grades and all the way through college. So it's best to kind of create these good habits from the beginning. It can be intentional, but it can also be often unintentional. So the goal is for us to make sure students understand as early as possible what it is and how to avoid it. So you cannot use somebody else's ideas or words without giving them proper credit. And students at this age can understand conceptually what that means. This is a really great website. This is the Purdue Online Writing Lab. And if you're like me and you've been out of school for a few years and you don't remember a lot about citations for papers, this is a great option to go to and to kind of refresh on what it is and what the current citation practices are. So this has an overview of plagiarism, and this also has lots of different information on best practices for research, writing, and citations. So as parents, if we want to go, find some information, that can be really useful. The most important thing for students to understand at this age is that if they're using somebody else's ideas or information, they have to give them credit. This can be when paraphrasing or quoting, but either way, they need to give credit to the author of that source, and they need to be able to understand the difference between a paraphrase and a quote. I don't recommend using full citations yet. As students get older, of course, they will be expected to in high school, middle school, high school, college. but they can cite the author's last name or website in parentheses after the information is used. They should also be in the habit of using a reference list at the end of whatever it is they produced. As they're taking notes, I highly recommend they either paraphrase or quote, and identify, make sure they know which is which. You cannot quote without quotation marks. I always tell them you have to include those quotation marks in your notes. So Kathy Schuck she's been around for a long time. She does a lot of work with tech and the internet and teaching. And she has a research and style manual on a grade by grade basis. So uh, she has, hold on one second. So she has for each grade what she thinks is grade appropriate in terms of citations. So if you look for grade 3, she tells you for a book, they should be able to include the last name of the author, first name, title of the book, and the year the book was published. And then she tells you for each piece. So if you go to her website, let me just click over there. She has this for all the different grades, beginning with first, I believe, and up through sixth. So that's really helpful to get. And this is under schrockguide.net. If you just Google works cited pages for different ages, you should be able to find that. All right. Many students make mistakes in paraphrasing. So I always encourage my students to actually rewrite the information in their own words without copying and pasting and without directly looking at the source. So I think at this age, we want to be really careful that students aren't relying on copying and pasting to get through writing a paper, because it's a really bad habit and can lead to kind of errors and mistakes in plagiarizing. So what I suggest they do is read a paragraph. If they think there's an important fact they want to include, write the fact as they remember it down in their notes, and then add this fact to the paper in a new sentence. That way there's kind of 2 levels of separation between the original source and their paper. So this is a book on life underwater in the ocean. And a couple of things that I found interesting, I'm going to read. Ocean plants make oxygen that animals breathe. Fish use gills to get oxygen from the water. And then here's another section that I'm going to reference. Algae are the most important producers on Earth. Algae make most of the oxygen that animals breathe. Ocean animals also eat algae. Algae needs sunlight to grow. Sunlight is brighter near the surface of the ocean, so algae grow only near the surface. So from this section, I would have, the student would read maybe this page or this section, and they would say, oh, the title of the book is Ocean Food Webs in Action. The quote I want to use is ocean plants make oxygen that animals breathe. Then they would cite that quote with the author last name and the page number. That's all they need to include for now. And then paraphrase, I would try to have them remember what was most important out of this paragraph that they read. And then they would try to rewrite it in their own words. Algae provide food and oxygen for ocean animals. You want to keep this simple. You want to make sure that they're using their own words and not copying exactly. There should be a completely different sentence structure. So not just changing out 1 or 2 words. So that's something to keep in mind, because a lot of kids will just substitute 1 word, and that's actually still using the author's words. You have to really create new words and say it in your own way. Okay, so the last step, which is not really my emphasis here, but I just kind of wanted to go over, is that the last step of the research process is always to present the information and think about action. So that can be writing. It can be presenting the information in different kinds of ways, like through film, through a presentation, through building something. And then there can be often an accompanying action. So how can this information best be presented is one of the questions that the students will be asking through this process. And then does this new information give the student any ideas for actions, right? What can they do with this information that they've gained. This will help focus the research and have the student think through how best to present the information. So thank you so much for joining me today. Feel free to reach out with any further thoughts or questions. rjacobs@compasscharterschools.org. And my credits today, the first graphic is from John Crawford and Elizabeth Crawford for the U.S. Fund for UNICEF curriculum. That's from 2017. I like it because it really captures the full kind of depth of the research process. The second image I used is just a photograph I took from Creative Commons. The book is called Ocean Food Webs in Action by Paul Fleischer. And the website I referenced is Kathy Schrock, schrockguide.net, and it's her works cited for grades 1 through 6. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and feel free to reach out with any questions.